In the summer of 1979, on a rocky shoulder of ground southwest of the old walls of Jerusalem, a man knelt in the dark of a burial chamber and lifted something out of the dust that was smaller than his thumb. It was gray. It was rolled. It looked like nothing at all, like a scrap of foil pressed flat by centuries, the sort of thing a tired excavator might brush aside without a second glance. It weighed almost nothing in the palm. The place was called Ketef Hinnom, which means the shoulder of Hinnom, a low limestone ridge looking across the valley toward Mount Zion. The archaeologist was Gabriel Barquet. The tombs there had been robbed and reused, and robbed again for 2,500 years. Ottoman soldiers had stored rifles in one of them. Looters had emptied the burial benches long before anyone thought to write down what was taken. By every reasonable expectation, there was nothing left in that hillside worth the labor of finding. But beneath one of the benches, in a repository cut into the floor, where the bones of the dead had been swept when the bench was needed again, the looters had missed something. More than 1,000 objects lay under the collapsed rubble. Pottery, arrowheads, jewelry, and 2 small rolled cylinders of silver. They were so fragile that nobody dared open them. Museums in Britain and Germany were each offered the job, and each declined, on the reasonable grounds that the attempt would probably destroy them. They sat, unopened, for 3 years. The work was finally entrusted to a conservator at the Israel Museum named Joseph Shenhav, who worked out a method: soften the corrosion with a solution, then bond a flexible backing to the exposed surface so the metal had something to hold onto as it came unwound. It took months. In the autumn of 1982, the larger plaque came open. A strip of silver, about 9.5 centimeters long, roughly the length of a finger, covered in writing so small it could hardly be seen. The letters were Paleo-Hebrew, the old angular script of the Kingdom of Judah, scratched into the metal with a fine point by someone working close to a lamp. And when the words were read, they were words that anyone raised in an English-speaking church would recognize instantly. The Lord bless thee and keep thee. The Lord make his face shine upon thee and be gracious unto thee. The Lord lift up his countenance upon thee and give thee peace. That is Numbers 6, verse 24 to 26, in the King James rendering. On the silver, in Hebrew, it is shorter and older and slightly different in its phrasing, and it is not quoting a Bible, because there was not yet a Bible to quote, but it is the same blessing. And the silver is older than almost everything else we have. Barquet and his colleagues dated the plaques to the late 7th century before Christ. That places them before the Babylonian armies came, before the walls of Jerusalem came down, roughly 400 years earlier than the oldest of the Dead Sea Scrolls. There is a minority of scholars who have argued for a later date, and Barquet's team published a full re-examination in the year 2004 using advanced imaging, which reaffirmed the earlier reading. Most of the field accepts the pre-exilic date. That is where the evidence currently sits. Hold that small rolled thing in your mind tonight. A strip of silver, thinner than a fingernail, curled tight enough to close inside a fist. Someone wore it against the skin, under the clothes, where nobody could see it. We are going to travel a very long way from that hillside, into Egypt and Assyria and Babylon, into a library in Alexandria and a cave above the Dead Sea, into a stone room in Tiberias where men counted letters by candlelight for the love of getting it right. And at the end, we will come back to it. Because tonight, the story is not the story you have heard. Tonight, we are not walking through the Old Testament book by book, from a garden to a flood to a promise to a king. You know that shape. You have known it since you were small. Tonight, we are following the words themselves, where they came from, what they were written on, who carried them, who copied them, who counted them, who died holding them. The Old Testament has a history of its own, apart from the history it tells, and that history is one of the most remarkable survival stories in the human record. It is a story that runs, from first scratch to finished form, across something like 1,400 years. It crosses 3 empires and 4 languages. It is written on stone and clay and reed paper and animal skin, and once at least on silver. And it is, from beginning to end, the work of people who believed that what they were handling did not belong to them. Let us begin before the writing. There is a thing we have to say plainly at the start, because it shapes everything that follows. For most of the period the Old Testament describes, almost nobody could read. This is not a criticism of the ancient world. It is simply the condition of the ancient world. Writing was a specialized craft, like metalworking or midwifery, and it was concentrated in the places that needed it: palaces, temples, granaries, army posts, tax offices. In Mesopotamia, the craft was enormously demanding. Cuneiform, the wedge writing pressed into wet clay with a cut reed, required a working knowledge of hundreds of signs. A scribe trained for years in a school the Sumerians called the Adaba, the tablet house, copying lists and proverbs and law codes until his hand knew them. Egypt was no easier. Hieroglyphic writing and its cursive shorthand demanded the same long apprenticeship. In both civilizations, the ability to write was a form of power, and it stayed inside a small professional class that guarded it carefully. Then, something happened in the turquoise mines of Sinai. At a place called Serabit el-Qadim, in the 2nd millennium before Christ, Egyptian expeditions worked seasonal mines with the help of Semitic-speaking laborers from the north, Canaanites, people whose language was a cousin of Hebrew. Somebody among them, or among people like them, did something extraordinary. They looked at the Egyptian signs and had an idea that seems obvious now and was not obvious then. Instead of one sign for a word, or one sign for a syllable, why not one sign for a single sound? Take the picture of an ox head, which in their language was aleph, and let it stand not for an ox, but simply for the sound at the beginning of the word. Take the picture of a house, bayit, and let it stand for the b. Take the picture of a palm of a hand, kaf, for the k. Do that 24 times, and you have a system a farmer could learn in an afternoon. The scratched inscriptions from Sinai are known as Proto-Sinaitic, and were first published from finds made in the winter of 1904 and 1905 by Flinders Petrie and Hilda Petrie. Related inscriptions were later found at Wadi el-Hol in Egypt, which suggested to many scholars that the invention happened inside Egypt rather than in the mines. The details are still debated, and honest scholarship says so. What is not debated is the consequence. The alphabet was the most democratizing invention of the ancient world, and every alphabet on Earth today, including the one these words are written in, descends from that idea. 22 letters. That is what Hebrew ended up with. 22 shapes, no vowels written, running right to left across the surface. A child could learn them. A soldier could learn them. A potter's apprentice could scratch a name on a broken jar and be understood. And that fact, that ordinary people in a small hill country could write, turns out to matter enormously for the history of the Bible. We will come back to it with hard evidence from a desert fort. First, the physical things. Imagine, for a moment, the room. It is evening in a town in the hill country of Judah, sometime in the 7th century before Christ. The heat has gone out of the day, and the stone walls are giving back the last of it. Outside, the smell of an oven, dung fuel and barley bread, and somewhere below, a dog, and the intermittent bleat of sheep being counted into a fold. The room is small. There is a single olive oil lamp on a stand, a shallow clay saucer with a pinched spout, and the wick throws a light about the size of a spread hand. Everything beyond that circle is the color of weak tea. A man sits on a low stool with a board across his knees. He is not old. His fingers are stained black at the tips, and the stain will not come out. It is one of the marks of the trade, like a carpenter's callus. In front of him is a shallow dish of ink. It is made from soot, lampblack, scraped from the underside of a vessel held over a flame, mixed with gum and a little water until it moves like thin honey. It smells faintly of burnt oil and of the tree resin that binds it. His pen is a reed, cut at an angle and split at the tip so it holds a bead of ink. He trims it with a small knife every few lines, because a reed goes soft as it works. The knife is also how he corrects a mistake. On skin he can scrape the error away, and on papyrus he can sponge it while it is wet, but once it dries into the fiber it stays. The surface in front of him is papyrus. If he is writing something ordinary and can afford it, papyrus is Egyptian, the pith of a river reed, cut into strips, laid in 2 crossed layers, pressed and dried and polished with a stone until it takes ink. It is light, it rolls beautifully, and in the damp winters of the hill country, it eventually rots into nothing. If what he is writing is meant to last, the surface is skin. Sheep or goat, soaked and de-haired and stretched on a frame and scraped down thin, then rubbed smooth. Parchment is expensive. Parchment is also nearly immortal in dry conditions, and that single fact is why anything survived at all. And if he is only writing a receipt or a note to a quartermaster about wine, he does not use either. He picks up a broken piece of pottery from the yard. Potsherds were the scrap paper of the ancient Near East. They were everywhere. They were free, and ink sits on their surface for 2,500 years without complaint. Scholars call them ostraka, from the Greek word for a shell or a shard, and they are the reason we can hear ordinary people from the Iron Age speaking in their own voices. He rules his lines first, scoring the surface lightly so the letters sit straight. Then he begins, right to left, and the only sounds in the room are the reed on the skin, the small hiss of the wick, and his own breathing. That is the workshop. That is where all of it came from. Not a cathedral, not a council. A man on a stool with a burnt soot pot and a cut reed, working while the light lasted. Now, before we go further, one word. The word is Torah, and almost everyone who has sat in an English-speaking church has been told it means law. That translation is not wrong, exactly, but it is narrow enough to be misleading, and the Hebrew underneath it is worth a minute of your evening. Torah comes from a verb root, yara. The root means, at its most physical, to throw or to cast. It is used of throwing a stone. It is used of water pouring down as rain, and it is used, very specifically, of shooting an arrow. From that same root comes the word more, a teacher, and the connection is not accidental. A teacher, in the old Hebrew picture, is one who throws, one who points, one who aims the student's attention at something and says, "There, go that way." So Torah is not primarily a legal code in the sense a modern person hears the word. It is instruction. It is aim. It is the finger extended down the road, or the arrow released toward a mark. And there is a quiet symmetry in the language that the rabbis noticed long ago. The common Hebrew word for sin, chata, carries the sense of missing, the arrow that goes wide. Instruction aims, sin misses. The same picture, taken from a bowman's field, holds both halves. When you hear the word law in an English Old Testament tonight, you may find it worth hearing aim instead. It changes the temperature of a great many verses. Now to the oldest Hebrew writing we can actually put a finger on. In 1908, an Irish archaeologist named R.A. Stewart McAllister was digging at Gezer, a mound about 20 miles west of Jerusalem, and turned up a small limestone plaque, a little over 4 inches long. On it were 7 short lines of letters. It is not a psalm. It is not a prophecy. It is, as far as most readers can tell, a list of the agricultural year. 2 months of gathering, 2 months of sowing, 2 months of late planting, a month of hoeing flax, a month of barley harvest, and so on around the circuit of the seasons. It is usually dated to the 10th century before Christ, which would put it in the era the Bible assigns to Solomon. Scholars are genuinely divided about whether its language should be called Hebrew or Phoenician, and about whether the script is Paleo-Hebrew or something earlier. The excavation was not stratified, which weakens the dating. The Gezer calendar sits in Istanbul now. Nobody knows why it was written. A schoolboy's exercise, some have suggested, a mnemonic for learning the farming year. A tax schedule, others say. It may simply be a man setting down the shape of the year, because the shape of the year mattered. A century later, in 2008, excavators at Khirbet Qeiyafa, a fortified town on the border between Judah and Philistia, dated to around the year 1000 before Christ, found a potsherd with 5 lines of faded ink. Yosef Garfinkel, who directed the dig, and his epigrapher Haggai Miskav read the language as Hebrew. Christopher Rolston, one of the most careful epigraphers working today, published a cautious dissent, arguing that the script is early alphabetic rather than specifically Hebrew, and that the language could belong to any of several Semitic tongues. Aaron Dembski, a senior Israeli epigrapher, disagreed with Rolston in turn and argued that the Gezer calendar and the Isbet Sartah abecedary should count as Hebrew. This is what a live scholarly argument looks like, and it is worth watching for a moment before we move on. Notice that nobody in this exchange is trying to embarrass anybody. 3 specialists look at the same faint marks on the same broken pot and read them differently, because the marks are faint and the categories of that period are genuinely blurry. That is not a scandal. That is the ordinary weather of the discipline. What all of them agree on is the larger point. By the 10th century before Christ, in the hill country between the coast and the desert, people were writing with an alphabet. The tool that would eventually carry the Old Testament was already in the hands of farmers and clerks. The books had not been written. The alphabet that would write them was ready. Let us move forward, then, into the Age of Kings. And let us do it by looking at 2 stones that were set up by Israel's enemies. On the 19th of August, 1868, an Anglican missionary named Frederick Augustus Klein was traveling on horseback through the country east of the Dead Sea, in what is now Jordan. He had come to treat the sick. Very few Europeans had gone into that region since the Crusades. At an encampment of the Bani Hamida near the ruins of Diban, the site of ancient Diban, his Bedouin hosts mentioned an inscribed stone lying among the stones of the old city. Klein asked to see it. They took him there. It was black basalt, roughly the shape of a headstone, about 1 meter tall, rounded at the top, and covered in 34 lines of writing with a small dot between each word. Klein could not read it. Neither could his hosts. He made note of it and rode on. What followed is one of the sadder episodes in the history of archaeology. Word spread. The Berlin Museum and the French consulate both began negotiating for it. Pressure came down through the Ottoman authorities, and the local people, who had good reason to resent that pressure, broke the stone into pieces rather than surrender it. Before it was broken, an intermediary working for the French scholar Charles Clermont-Ganneau had taken a squeeze, a papier-mâché impression pressed onto the surface, which lifts off carrying the shape of every letter. That squeeze survived. Clermont-Ganneau later recovered most of the fragments, 613 letters of an original 1,000 or so, and reassembled what could be reassembled. The stone is in the Louvre. It is called the Mesha stele, or the Moabite stone, and it is dated to around 840 years before Christ. It opens with a king introducing himself. I am Mesha, son of Chemosh, king of Moab, the Dibonite. He explains that his god Chemosh had been angry with Moab and had allowed Israel to oppress it under a king named Omri. He explains that Chemosh then relented, and that he, Mesha, threw off the yoke and took back the towns. Now open your Bible to 2 Kings 3, and you will find Mesha there. He is described as a sheep master who paid tribute to Israel in lambs and wool, and who rebelled after the death of Ahab. Two accounts of the same rebellion, one written in Hebrew in Jerusalem and preserved because a religious community kept copying it, one carved in Moabite, a Canaanite dialect close enough to Hebrew that a Hebrew reader can follow most of it, set up in Dibon to the glory of Chemosh, and preserved because it fell over and got buried. They do not agree about who won. Of course they do not. Neither monument was built to be neutral, and every royal inscription in the ancient Near East is an advertisement. But they agree that there was a kingdom of Israel with a king named Omri. They agree that Moab was subject to it. They agree that Moab rebelled, and that convergence from two hostile pens is the kind of thing historians live on. 25 years later, in July of 1993, at the northern edge of the country, a similar thing happened again. The site was Tel Dan, up near the headwaters of the Jordan, where the excavation had been running for more than 20 years under Avraham Biran. That season, the team was working on the Great Gate Complex. A member of the team named Gila Cook noticed a triangular piece of basalt in a wall by the path, reused as building material, set into a pavement, the way old stone always ends up when a city rebuilds. It had writing on it, Aramaic writing, 13 surviving lines of it, from a victory monument that had been deliberately smashed in antiquity and its pieces recycled into masonry. 2 more fragments turned up in June of the following year. Biran and his colleague Joseph Nave published the finds in 1993 and 1995. The monument was almost certainly set up by Hazael of Aram Damascus, or possibly his son, in the late 9th century before Christ. The king boasts of killing 2 enemy kings. The names are damaged, and in the 9th line of the largest fragment stand 4 Hebrew letters, Beth Yod Tav, then Dalet Vav Dalet, run together without a break, Baited Dudu, House of David. Before 1993, a serious position existed in the scholarly world holding that David was a legendary figure, a national founder myth of the kind many peoples possess, with no external attestation whatsoever. That position became much harder to hold after a hostile Aramean king carved the name of David's dynasty into a stone to celebrate beating it. There is still argument about the reading. There is always argument. One scholar has maintained that an extra letter on the fragment overturns the standard reconstruction. The great majority of epigraphers accept the reading as it stands. And the French scholar André Lemaire, after 7 years studying the Mesha stele in the Louvre, argued in 1994 that the phrase House of David appears there too, in a damaged line. That reading is more contested than the Tel Dan one. I mention it as a live proposal rather than a settled fact. Here is the thing I want you to notice about both stones, and it is the reason we started with them. Neither was written by a believer. Neither was written to support anything. Mesha wanted glory for Chemosh. Hazael wanted glory for Hadad. Both would have been astonished and displeased to learn that their monuments would end up as footnotes in the study of Israel's scriptures. The Old Testament does not exist in a sealed room. It grew up inside a world of other kingdoms, other gods, other archives, other kings cutting their victories into basalt. And when we can hear those other voices, the picture gets larger rather than smaller. Now the empire arrives, and everything changes. For most of its history, the small kingdoms of the Levant lived in the gaps between great powers. Egypt to the south, Mesopotamia to the north and east, and a corridor of hills and coastal plain in between that everybody's army had to march through. In the 8th century before Christ, the gap closed. Assyria, under a line of formidable kings, began absorbing the West systematically, not as tribute-taking raids but as annexation, with deportations, resettlements, and provincial administration. The northern kingdom of Israel, with its capital at Samaria, fell to that machine in the year 722 before Christ. Its population was scattered across the Assyrian Empire, and other peoples were moved in to replace them. The 10 tribes did not so much vanish as dissolve. Judah, smaller and further south and tucked into more defensible hills, survived. It survived as a vassal, paying, and then, under a king named Hezekiah, it stopped paying. The Assyrian answer came in the year 701 before Christ. We have both sides of this one, and they are worth setting beside each other slowly, because it is the single best documented moment in the entire Old Testament, and because the way the two accounts differ is itself instructive. The Assyrian version is written on clay prisms, 6-sided baked columns inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform and deposited in the foundations of royal buildings. Several survive. The best known is the Taylor prism, found in the ruins of Nineveh and now in the British Museum, inscribed around 691 before Christ. Sennacherib, king of Assyria, records his third campaign. He states that Hezekiah of Judah did not submit to his yoke. He states that he besieged and took 46 of Hezekiah's fortified cities and countless smaller towns, using earthen ramps and battering rams. He states the number of people he carried off, and it is a very large number. He lists the tribute that came to him afterward: gold, silver, precious stones, ivory-inlaid furniture, and members of Hezekiah's own household. And of Jerusalem he says this, that he shut Hezekiah up in his royal city like a bird in a cage, and built siege works around him, and did not let anyone come out of the gates. Read that sentence again. Shut him up like a bird in a cage. Assyrian royal annals are not modest documents. When Sennacherib took a city, he said so, at length, with details about what he did to its officials. 46 cities, named and counted. About Jerusalem, he says only that he penned the king in. There is no capture, there is no sack, there is no installation of a governor. For a monarch who recorded everything, that silence is very loud. The biblical account, in 2 Kings 18 and 19, and again in Isaiah 36 and 37, agrees on the siege and disagrees about how it ended. It records a night of catastrophe in the Assyrian camp and a withdrawal, and Sennacherib's later death at the hands of his own sons in the house of his God. The Assyrian records confirm the assassination. They do not, naturally, describe the disaster in the camp. So we have 3 registers here, and the honest thing is to name them. The record shows an Assyrian campaign in 701, 46 Judean cities taken, Jerusalem besieged and not taken, heavy tribute paid, and Sennacherib murdered by his sons some 20 years later. Scholarly interpretation debates what broke the siege: plague, an Egyptian relief force, trouble at home, or some combination. The tradition holds that the angel of the Lord went out and smote the camp of the Assyrians. I am not going to adjudicate that for you tonight, and I would think less of myself if I tried. What I will say is that everyone in Jerusalem, on the morning the Assyrian army was gone, agreed that they should have died and had not. And people who have been spared write things down. There is a piece of physical evidence from that siege that you can still walk through, and it is one of my favorite objects in this whole account. Jerusalem had a water problem. Its only reliable spring, the Gihon, lay outside the defensible line, down in the Kidron Valley. A besieging army that controlled the spring controlled how long the city could hold. So somebody cut a tunnel. It runs 1,750 feet through solid limestone from the Gihon spring, west and south, in a long curving S, until it comes out at the pool of Siloam inside the walls. You can wade it today in about half an hour, in cold water, with the rock a hand's width from either shoulder. In 1880, some boys swimming in the tunnel near the southern outlet noticed writing carved into the wall. The Siloam inscription, as it is known, is written in the Hebrew script of the late 8th century. It does not mention a king. It does not praise God. It is, of all things, an engineering note, and it is written by the workmen. It describes how two teams dug toward each other from opposite ends, and how, when there were still a few cubits to go, each team could hear the voices of the other through the rock, and how they broke through and the water ran from the spring to the pool. Think about that for a moment. Two crews, hundreds of feet underground, working by lamplight with iron picks, cutting toward a sound. The moment described is the moment they heard each other. Nobody knows for certain how they managed the alignment. It is still discussed. The inscription was later chiseled out of the wall by Vandals, seized by the Ottoman authorities, and sent to Istanbul, where it remains. And here is why it belongs in a story about the making of Scripture. It is not Scripture. It has nothing to do with Scripture. But it proves, beyond argument, that in Hezekiah's Jerusalem, there were ordinary working men who could compose a clear narrative paragraph in Hebrew and cut it into stone. The world that produced the Old Testament was a literate world, not universally literate, not in our sense, but literate enough that a tunneling crew could leave a note about their own achievement in good prose, without a royal scribe standing over them. Which brings us to a scroll found in a temple, and to one of the genuinely great scenes in the Hebrew Bible. The year is 622 before Christ. The king is Josiah, and he has been on the throne since he was a child. He orders repairs to the temple, and money is collected, and workmen are hired, and in the course of the work, Hilkiah the high priest finds a book. He gives it to Shaphan the scribe. Shaphan reads it. Then Shaphan goes to the king and reads it aloud to him. And when the king had heard the words of the book of the law, he rent his clothes. That is 2 Kings 22 verse 11, and it is a sentence with a great deal packed into it. Josiah tears his robe because he understands, hearing the words, that the kingdom has not been keeping them. The scroll is not comforting. The scroll is an indictment. He sends a delegation to verify it, not to a priest, to a prophet, and specifically to a woman named Huldah, who lived in Jerusalem and whose husband kept the wardrobe. She authenticates the book and delivers a hard word about what is coming. Then Josiah begins the most sweeping religious reform in the history of Judah. The high places are shut down. The altars outside Jerusalem are broken. Sacrifice is centralized at the temple. The Passover is kept in a way, the text says, that it had not been kept since the days of the judges. Now, what was the book? The traditional answer, held for a very long time and still held by many, is that it was the book of the law given through Moses, Deuteronomy, or the whole Torah, which had been neglected, lost in the disorder of the previous reigns, and rediscovered. The critical answer, first argued in 1805 by the German scholar Wilhelm de Wette and developed by Julius Wellhausen later in the 19th century, is that the scroll was essentially Deuteronomy, or a core of it, and that its program matches Josiah's reform so precisely because the two belong to the same moment. Deuteronomy insists on one place of sacrifice. Josiah centralizes sacrifice at one place. Deuteronomy demands the removal of the high places. Josiah removes the high places. The fit is very tight. Interestingly, the identification of the scroll with Deuteronomy is much older than modern criticism. Jerome, in the 4th century after Christ, made the same identification. So did Thomas Hobbes in the 17th. The book has looked like Deuteronomy to careful readers in every century. Where the readings diverge is on the question of age. Was this an ancient text recovered, or a text of that generation given ancient authority? And that is a question the evidence, as it currently stands, cannot close. So let me tell you where I sit, and let me be clear that this is a reading rather than a finding. The reading I find most persuasive is that both halves are true, and that the framing of the question as either-or is the problem. Ancient scribal cultures did not work the way modern authorship works. A text was not finished and then frozen. It was carried, taught, expanded, applied, and reissued for new circumstances, and all of that could be done by people who understood themselves as transmitting rather than composing. Under that view, a body of Mosaic instruction of genuine antiquity was reworked and given its Deuteronomic shape during or just before Josiah's reign, by scribes who believed absolutely that they were preserving what had been given, not inventing it. The tearing of the king's robe is not the reaction of a man being handled. It is the reaction of a man who has just heard something he recognizes as older and higher than himself. I hold that gently. Others hold otherwise, in good faith and with more Hebrew than I have. I offer it because I think a story like this deserves a narrator willing to say what he actually thinks, rather than one who lists options and hides behind them. What the episode establishes beyond dispute is this. By the late 7th century, a written scroll had become the standard against which a kingdom measured itself. Not a priest's memory, not a prophet's fresh word, a text, read aloud, that could make a king weep. That is a shift with enormous consequences. It is the moment a religion of place and sacrifice starts becoming, in addition, a religion of the book, and that is what will let it survive the loss of the place, because the place is about to be lost. Let me put you inside the last generation of the kingdom, because we have unusually good evidence for it, and because it is the moment the archaeology and the biblical text get closest to touching. There was a fort at Arad, on the southern frontier of Judah, at the edge of the Negev. It was small, the built area about 2 dunams, perhaps 20 or 30 soldiers in garrison. Excavation there in the 1960s turned up more than 100 ostraca, ink on potsherd, dating to around 600 before Christ. A large number of them belonged to the archive of a man named Eliashib, who was the quartermaster. They are not literature. They are the paperwork of a small military post. Issue this much flour, issue this much wine, send bread to these men, account for the oil. One of them is about vinegar in the wine cellar. Another concerns rations for a unit passing through. They are, in the most literal sense, the shopping lists of the Kingdom of Judah in its final years. In the year 2016, a team at Tel Aviv University published a study of these sherds in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Shira Feigenbaum-Golovin led it, working with Ari Schaus, Barak Sober, Eli Turkel, Eli Piasecki, Nadav Naaman, Benjamin Sass, David Levin, and Israel Finkelstein. They took 16 of the inscriptions and ran them through image processing and machine learning algorithms designed to distinguish handwriting. The question was simple. How many different people wrote these? The answer was at least 6. 6 distinct hands, in a fort holding perhaps 30 men, in correspondence written within a span of a few months. 4 years later, in 2020, a follow-up study in the journal PLOS ONE brought in Jana Gerber, a forensic document examiner, alongside the algorithmic work. Examining 18 inscriptions from the same assemblage, that study found a high probability of at least 12 distinct writers. 12, in a garrison of 20 or 30. And these were not scribes by profession. The letters run from the commander of the fort down to the deputy quartermaster. All of them used correct spelling and syntax. Sit with what that means. Literacy at the far southern edge of a small kingdom, in the ranks, not confined to a professional class in the capital. If the frontier could read and write at that level, the capital could do far more. The researchers drew the obvious conclusion for the history of the text. The human infrastructure required to compose and copy substantial literary works was in place in Judah before the destruction of Jerusalem, not only after it. That does not settle when any particular book was written. It removes one common argument about when they could not have been. The same team went looking further north and further back. In 2020, they published a study in the journal PLOS ONE applying the method to a much older set of documents. The Samaria Ostraka, from the capital of the northern kingdom, dated roughly 1.5 to 2 centuries before the Arad material. These are administrative records, deliveries of wine and oil to the palace, noted with the regnal year, the place of origin, and the names of those involved. They were excavated at Samaria early in the 20th century and have been studied ever since. The handwriting analysis suggested a small number of hands managing a substantial flow of goods, which is the signature of an organized bureaucratic apparatus rather than a few literate individuals working ad hoc. Put the two studies together, and you get a picture with real depth to it. In the 8th century, a northern royal administration running on written records. In the 7th, a southern kingdom where literacy has spread well past the palace, out to the officers and quartermasters of a frontier post. Neither study tells us that anyone at Samaria or Arad was writing scripture. That is not the claim, and the researchers do not make it. What they establish is capacity. Somewhere in that world were people who could hold a long text in their heads, set it down accurately, check it against an exemplar, and train a successor to do the same. You cannot get a book like Kings out of a society that lacks those people. You can get one out of a society that has them. And Kings, remember, tells you it is working from records. The Chronicles of the Kings of Israel, the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah, cited over and over, as though the reader might want to go and look. The Ostraka are what such records look like when the palace they were kept in has burned, and only the potsherds are left. And then there is Lachish. Lachish was the second city of Judah, a great fortified place in the Shephelah, the low hills between the coastal plain and the Judean highlands. Sennacherib had besieged it a century earlier and was proud enough of taking it to cover a room of his palace at Nineveh with carved reliefs of the assault. In January and February of 1935, during the third season of the Welcome Expedition, the British archaeologist James Leslie Starkey was excavating the gate complex when his team found 18 inscribed potsherds in a room beside the gate, in the burn destruction layer. 3 more turned up in 1938. They are letters, military dispatches, written in carbon ink in classical Hebrew prose, sent to a commander named Yaush at Lachish. They date to around 590 before Christ, in the final Babylonian campaign. Only about a third are legible enough to follow throughout. But what is legible is extraordinary, because these are not literary compositions. They are the last messages of frightened professionals doing their jobs. Letter 4 contains the line that everyone remembers. The writer, an officer named Josiah, reports that he is carrying out his orders, and then adds that he and his men are watching for the fire signals of Lachish, according to the code the commander gave them, because they cannot see Hezekiah. Fire signals. That is how a hill country communicated across distance. Beacons lit on high points, in a prearranged code, relayed from post to post, and Hezekiah is dark. Now turn to Jeremiah 34 verse 7, which describes the same campaign from inside the capital, and reads, "When the king of Babylon's army fought against Jerusalem, and against all the cities of Judah that were left, against Lachish, and against Azekah, for these defenced cities remained of the cities of Judah, 2 fortified cities left." And a soldier in a forward post writes that one of the 2 beacons has gone out. Scholars note, correctly, that there is a less dramatic possible reading. Visibility can fail for weather. The Hebrew is fragmentary. Nobody should build a doctrine on an ostrakon. But the plain sense of the sentence is that Hezekiah has fallen and Lachish is now alone, and the man writing knows what that means for him personally. There is a second detail in these letters that stops me every time. Letter 6 uses a particular phrase about someone whose messages are discouraging the soldiers. The princes, it says, are weakening the hands of the people. Weakening the hands. That exact phrase appears in Jeremiah 38 verse 4, where the officials of Jerusalem accused Jeremiah himself of weakening the hands of the men of war by prophesying that the city will fall. Letter 3 mentions a prophet and says that letters from this prophet have been passed up the chain to Jerusalem. Is the prophet Jeremiah? Some scholars have suggested it. It cannot be demonstrated. Prophets were not rare in that generation, and the name is not given. What is demonstrated is that a phrase we know from the book of Jeremiah was live military slang in Judah in the same decade, used by soldiers about the effect of defeatist talk on morale. The book is speaking the language of its moment. You can hear the period in it. Set the pieces beside one another and hold them there for a moment. A quartermaster at Arad writing out wine rations in a fort of 30 men, one of at least 12 people there who could write, an officer in the Shephelah watching a horizon for a light that does not come, a prophet in Jerusalem being accused, in the same idiom, of taking the strength out of the soldier's hands, and somewhere in the city, or just outside it, a small strip of silver being scratched with a blessing and rolled tight and hung around somebody's neck. They were all alive at the same time. Within a few years, nearly all of it was ash. The city fell in the summer of the year 586 before Christ, after a siege of about 18 months. The walls were breached. The temple that Solomon had built was burned, and its bronze cut up for transport. The palace burned. The houses of the great burned. The population that survived was walked north and east, in stages, to Babylonia. Archaeologically, the destruction layer is unmistakable. At Lachish, at Jerusalem, at the small forts along the Negev line, there is a horizon of ash and collapsed masonry and burnt beam ends, and above it, for a long while, very little. What we need to think about tonight is what happened to the words. Some of it burned. That is simply true, and we should say it. Temple archives, palace records, whatever scrolls were kept in the chambers around the sanctuary. A fire in a stone building destroys papyrus completely, and leather almost as completely. Some of it went into the ground and stayed there, like the arid ostraca and the Lachish letters, which survived precisely because they were fired clay in a burnt room. Fire preserves pottery. It is one of the small ironies of the discipline that we can read a wine requisition from 600 before Christ and cannot read a single line of the temple library. And some of it walked to Babylon. Not, I think, in the form we might imagine. Not a cart of scrolls under guard. Deportation columns are not archives. What walked to Babylon was mostly carried in heads. This is where I want to introduce a scholar whose work has changed how a lot of people think about all of this. David Carr, of Union Theological Seminary in New York, published a book in 2005 called Writing on the Tablet of the Heart. His argument, developed by comparing Israel with Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and Greek practice, is that we have been picturing ancient texts wrongly. We imagine a library, shelves, copies, readers consulting them. That is a modern picture. In the ancient world, Carr argues, the written text and the memorized text were two aspects of one thing. Texts existed on scrolls, yes, but their primary home was in the trained memory of an educated class, and the scroll functioned partly as a support for recitation, a way of stabilizing and checking something that lived, day to day, in the mouth. Education, in that model, was not mainly about learning to decode marks. It was enculturation, taking the community's foundational literature, its narratives, its prophecies, its prayers and proverbs, and writing it, in the phrase Carr borrows from Jeremiah, on the tablet of the heart. If that is right, and I find it convincing, then the exile is survivable in a way it otherwise would not be. Burn every scroll in Jerusalem, and you have not destroyed the literature, because the literature is walking north in the memories of priests and scribes and the sons they trained. And once they arrive, something unexpected happens. They begin to write. There is a strong consensus across otherwise disagreeing schools of scholarship that the exile in Babylonia was one of the most productive periods in the entire history of the Hebrew Bible. Not despite the catastrophe, because of it. Consider the position those people were in. Everything that had defined them was gone. No temple, so no sacrifice. No king, so no covenant with the house of David visible on a throne. No land, no festivals in their proper place. What is left when all of that is taken? Words, and the Sabbath, and circumcision, and the memory of who you were. So they wrote. They gathered what they had. They arranged the history of the nation into a shape that could explain the disaster without abandoning the God who had allowed it. They preserved the prophets who had warned them, which is a remarkable thing for a community to do, because those prophets are on record saying that the disaster was deserved. Think about that. A defeated people, given the chance to curate its own memory, kept the documents that indicted it. There is almost no parallel for that in ancient literature. Nations do not preserve their own prosecutors. Ezekiel is our clearest window into it. A priest, deported in the first wave, living by a canal in Babylonia that the text calls the river Chebar. He would have been trained for a temple that no longer stood, in rituals he could no longer perform. His book contains, among the visions, an enormous and meticulous description of a temple. Measurements, gates, chambers, courts, the whole plan set out in detail. It is a building nobody could build, and he could not visit. That is what a priest does when the sanctuary is gone. He writes down the shape of it. He keeps the specifications. He preserves, in language, a thing that no longer exists in stone, so that when the exile ends, someone will know what to make. Much of what scholars call the priestly material in the Torah, the systems of sacrifice and purity and calendar, the careful genealogies, the ordered account of creation in the first chapter of Genesis, with its 7 measured days, is associated by most current scholarship with this priestly tradition, either shaped or finalized in the exilic and Persian periods. I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the sort of place where a person listening in the dark can feel the ground move. To say that priestly scribes in Babylon gave final shape to material about the tabernacle is not to say they made it up. The tradition itself insists it was handed down, and the argument among scholars is genuinely about shaping and dating, not about whether these people believed they were preserving something received. Here is the second reading I will offer you tonight, and again, it is a reading. The reading I find most persuasive is that the exile did not create the Old Testament and did not corrupt it. The exile compressed it. A people that had been carrying its traditions loosely, in temple practice, in local shrines, in oral instruction, in scattered scrolls, was forced by catastrophe to gather everything into a portable form, because portable was the only form that could survive. The book, as an object and as an idea, is partly a product of homelessness. That is a hard thought, and I think it is a true one. And it is the reason that when the temple fell a second time, 6 centuries later, the tradition did not die. It had already learned how, which is a good place to slow down for a moment, because we have been moving quickly through some heavy country. Picture Babylon, since we are there. The city is enormous by the standards of the age. Walls you could drive a chariot along, a processional way glazed in blue brick with lions in relief. A temple tower stepping up out of the flat river plain so that you can see it from a day's walk away. The land is nothing like the hill country. It is flat and green and cut everywhere with canals, and the light lies on it differently. In Judah, the horizon is close and broken. Here it goes on until it simply stops being visible. There are Judeans in the towns and villages along those canals. In communities we now know something about from Babylonian tablets, settlements with names that preserve where the people came from. They farm, they trade, they pay their taxes. Some of them prosper, And in the evening, when the work is done, someone in one of those houses says the words, "You have to imagine it without a synagogue, because there is not yet such a thing. Imagine a courtyard, a low fire, the smell of the canal and of barley cooking, perhaps a dozen people." An older man begins to recite, and the ones who have been taught join in at the places they know. They are saying the account of a garden. They are saying the promise made to a man who left Ur, which is a city these listeners could reach in a few days' travel, which must have been a strange thing to think about. They are saying the story of a people brought out of a different exile in Egypt a very long time ago. That is what the Old Testament was for a generation. Not a book on a shelf, a thing said aloud in a foreign country by people who had lost everything and were determined not to lose this. And then the empire changed hands. In October of the year 539 before Christ, the armies of Cyrus of Persia entered Babylon. The Babylonian chronicles say the city was taken without a battle. Cyrus himself entered a few weeks later and took the titles of the kings before him. We have a document from that moment. In March of 1879, an Assyrian Christian archaeologist named Hormuzd Rassam, working for the British Museum in the ruins of Babylon, excavated a small barrel-shaped cylinder of baked clay. Rassam is a figure worth a sentence. He was born in Mosul in 1826, across the Tigris from the ruins of Nineveh. He met Austin Henry Layard as a young man, trained under him, and became a capable excavator in his own right at a time when the field was overwhelmingly European. The object he found is about 9 inches long and inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform, 45 lines of it, though it is broken and incomplete. It had been laid as a foundation deposit in the Temple of Marduk. It is called the Cyrus Cylinder, and it is a Babylonian building inscription of an entirely conventional kind, composed by Marduk's priests in a deliberately archaic style. Modern claims that it is the first charter of human rights considerably overstate it. What it says is that the previous king, Nabonidus, had offended the gods, that Marduk therefore looked for a righteous ruler and chose Cyrus, that Cyrus entered the city peacefully, and that he restored sanctuaries and returned displaced peoples and their gods to their proper homes. Now open Ezra 1 verse 1 to 4, where a decree of Cyrus authorizes the exiles of Judah to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the house of the Lord. The cylinder does not mention Judah. It does not mention Jerusalem. Anyone who tells you it does has not read it. What it establishes is the policy that returning deported communities and restoring their sanctuaries was Cyrus's stated practice, publicly proclaimed, in the year the exile ended. The registers again. The record shows a Persian restoration policy in 539, expressed in Marduk's name. Scholarly interpretation debates how quickly and how completely any return to Judah followed, and whether the temple was an immediate priority. The tradition holds that the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, and that what looked like imperial administration was something else wearing its clothes. Isaiah 45 verse 1 calls Cyrus by name and calls him the Lord's anointed, which is a startling thing for a Hebrew text to say about a Gentile king, and which has occupied commentators for a very long time. People went home. Not all of them. A great many stayed in Babylonia, and that community would last more than 2,000 years and produce, among other things, the Talmud. But some went home, in waves, over decades, and they went home to a ruin and to a problem that turns out to be central to our story. The problem was this: the generation that returned had been formed in Babylon. Many had been born there. They spoke Aramaic, the working language of the Persian Empire, more comfortably than they spoke Hebrew. The scroll they had carried home was in Hebrew. And a scroll nobody can understand is not a scroll. It is an object. Which brings us to what I think is one of the most quietly important scenes in the whole Old Testament, and one that hardly anybody outside of scholarship talks about. It is in Nehemiah 8, and it happens at a gate in a rebuilt wall on the first day of the 7th month. The people gather in the open square before the water gate. They ask Ezra the scribe to bring the book of the law of Moses. He brings it. He stands on a wooden platform made for the purpose, with named men standing at his right hand and his left. And he opens it. And when he opens it, the text says, all the people stood up. He reads from morning until midday, and around him are Levites, 13 of whom are named, doing something the text describes with a phrase that has been argued over for centuries. The King James renders it, so they read in the book in the law of God distinctly, and gave the sense, and caused them to understand the reading, gave the sense. The Hebrew word underneath is meporash, and it carries the idea of something made distinct, separated out, made plain, and the strong likelihood. This is the reading that most scholars favor, and that Jewish tradition itself has long held. Is that what those Levites were doing was translating? Rendering the Hebrew into Aramaic, phrase by phrase, so that the crowd could follow. If that is right, then this scene in Nehemiah 8 is the beginning of an institution. The practice of a public reading in Hebrew, accompanied by a spoken Aramaic rendering, became standard in the synagogue, and the Aramaic renderings themselves were eventually written down. They are called the Targums, and some of them are very old. I find that scene almost unbearably moving, and I want to say why. Here is a community that has come back to a broken city. They are poor. The walls have just gone up under threat. The temple is a shadow of the one their grandparents described. Nothing about the restoration matches what the prophets had led them to expect. And they stand, all of them, in an open square for half a day to hear a book read in a language most of them cannot follow, with men beside the reader turning it into words they can. That is the moment the Old Testament becomes what it has been ever since, a text that requires interpreters and a community willing to stand there while it is interpreted. It is also the moment the scribe becomes the central religious figure, and that is a permanent change. The Hebrew word is sofer, plural sopherim. The root has to do with counting and with recording. The same 3 letters give you the word for a document and the word to number something. And there is a saying preserved in the Talmud, at Kiddushin 30a, explaining why the early sages were called sopherim, because they counted all the letters of the Torah. Whether that etymology is historically correct is disputed. What matters is that the tradition understood the scribe's work as counting, not composing, not deciding, counting, checking, making sure that what left your hands was what came into them. Hold on to that idea, because in about 1,500 years worth of our story, it is going to come back with extraordinary force in a room in Tiberias. Before we leave the Persian period, we should go a long way south, because there is a body of evidence there that tells us something honest about how varied Jewish practice still was. On an island in the Nile at the southern border of Egypt, opposite modern Aswan, at the first cataract, there was a garrison. The Egyptians called the island Abu. In Aramaic and Hebrew it was Yeb. The Greeks called it Elephantine. A community of Judean soldiers and their families lived there under Persian rule, and we know a great deal about them because their papers survived in the dry sand. The main archive was excavated in 1907 and 1908 by the German archaeologists Otto Rubensson and Friedrich Zucker, and published by Eduard Sachau in 1911. The documents are in Aramaic and date from about 495 to 399 before Christ. They include marriage contracts, property sales, loans, lawsuits, letters home. They are 4 centuries older than the Dead Sea Scrolls. These people had a temple on the island to their god, whom they call Yahu, a shortened form of the divine name, standing not far from the temple of the ram-headed Egyptian god Khnum. In 410 before Christ, That temple was destroyed, apparently at the instigation of Khnum's priests. The community wrote to the Persian governor of Judah, a man named Bagohi, and also to the sons of Sanballat in Samaria, asking for help to rebuild it. We have the letters, and there is one more document that everyone remembers, usually called the Passover Papyrus. It is a fragmentary letter from a man named Hananiah to Jedaniah, the community's leader, dated to the reign of Darius II, either 419 or 418 before Christ. The word Passover does not survive in the legible portion. What survives is instruction about a festival from the 15th to the 21st of Nisan, about avoiding leaven, about ritual cleanness. Some scholars have suggested that Hananiah may be the Hanani mentioned in Nehemiah 1 verse 2 and 7-2 as Nehemiah's brother. That is a proposal, not a fact, and it rests on the name and the timing. Now, what do we do with elephantine? Some writers use it as a weapon. Look, they say, a Jewish temple outside Jerusalem, in flat contradiction of Deuteronomy. Look, they say, at what the community may or may not have known about the calendar, and they use it to embarrass somebody. I have no interest in that, and I do not think it is good history. What elephantine actually shows is something quieter and more human. It shows a garrison community, cut off by 1,000 miles of river and desert from the center of its tradition, holding on to what it had. They kept their God's name. They kept a festival in the spring. They wrote to Jerusalem for help and expected to get it. They were doing what people far from home have always done, keeping what they could remember of what they had been given, imperfectly, and reaching back toward the center for guidance. The letter from Hananiah is a letter from the center reaching out. That is not a scandal. Anyone who has ever kept a family tradition alive across an ocean knows exactly what that is. And it tells us something important about the shape of our story. In the 5th century before Christ, there was not yet one settled, standard, universally distributed text. There was a tradition, a center, communities at the edges, and letters going back and forth. The standardizing was still ahead, and the next great step in it happened in a Greek city on the coast of Egypt. Alexander had come through in 332 before Christ, and after his death, his generals divided the world he had taken. Egypt went to Ptolemy, and Ptolemy's dynasty ruled from a new city on the Mediterranean coast that Alexander had founded and named for himself. Alexandria was, within 2 generations, the intellectual capital of the world. Its library was an imperial project of a kind nobody had attempted, an attempt to collect, in Greek, everything. There was a large Jewish community in Alexandria, large, prosperous, and increasingly Greek-speaking, and within a generation or two of settling, that community faced the same problem the returnees from Babylon had faced, in a new language. Their scriptures were in Hebrew. Their children spoke Greek. The traditional account of what happened next is preserved in a document called the Letter of Aristeas. It presents itself as a letter written by a courtier of Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who ruled Egypt in the first half of the 3rd century before Christ, to his brother Philocrates. The story it tells is this. Demetrius of Phalerum, the royal librarian, advises the king that the library ought to contain the laws of the Jews. The king sends a magnificent embassy to Jerusalem, with gifts for the temple, requesting the help of the high priest Eleazar. Eleazar sends 72 elders, 6 from each of the 12 tribes, along with fine manuscripts. The king receives them, feasts them for 7 days, questions each in turn, and is impressed by their wisdom. They withdraw and produce the translation. The Jewish community of Alexandria receives it with joy. 72 translators. In Latin, 70 is Septuaginta, and that rounded number gave the translation its name, the Septuagint. Scholars abbreviate it with the Roman numeral for 70, though we will not be using numerals tonight. Now, the honest assessment. Most scholars regard the letter of Aristeas as substantially fictional. The author was not a contemporary of Ptolemy II. He gives himself away in places. He appears to be an Alexandrian Jew writing in the 2nd century before Christ, perhaps around 150 to 100, and his purpose is partly to defend the translation's authority. Sylvie Honigman has argued in detail that the letter should be read not as history, but as a foundation narrative, a charter myth of the sort that scholarly communities in Alexandria also produced about Homer. And yet, historians broadly accept that the core is sound, that the Torah was translated into Greek in Alexandria during the 3rd century before Christ, and that it happened with some form of royal interest or support. The legend grew around something that occurred. Later tellings made it more miraculous. A version in the Talmud has Ptolemy shut 72 elders in 72 separate rooms without telling them why, and each produces an identical translation. Philo of Alexandria, writing in the 1st century after Christ, treats the translators as inspired. What actually happened, as far as anyone can reconstruct it, is that Greek-speaking Jews translated their own scriptures for their own use, beginning with the Torah, and that the other books were rendered piecemeal over the following century and more by different hands of varying skill. You can see the different hands in the Greek. Some books are rendered so literally that the Greek is awkward, following Hebrew word order like a man walking in someone else's shoes. Others are free and fluent. It is not one project. It is a tradition of projects, and this translation matters enormously for reasons nobody involved could have foreseen. It made the Hebrew scriptures readable by the entire Eastern Mediterranean. It put Genesis and Isaiah into the working language of the Roman world. When the first Christian preaching went out into that world a few centuries later, the scriptures it quoted were, overwhelmingly, these Greek ones. It also introduced a difference in contents. Greek collections circulating in Alexandria included books that the Hebrew collection did not. Tobit, Judith, Wisdom, Sirach, the books of the Maccabees, and others. That difference is where a great deal of later history comes from. And I want to handle it carefully, because different Christian traditions live on different sides of it, and both of them are listening tonight. Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Christians receive those additional books as scripture, calling them deuterocanonical. Protestants, following the Hebrew canon, place them outside scripture, and traditionally called them the Apocrypha, printing them between the Testaments in early English Bibles, including the original King James of 1611. That is a real difference, and I am not going to pretend it away or adjudicate it. What I will say is that it is a difference about the boundary of a collection, not about the words inside the books both traditions share, and that the disagreement is far older and far more thoughtfully argued on both sides than most people realize. We will come back to it when we get to Jerome, who had opinions. There is a Greek word we need, because it has quietly organized the last 2,000 years of this conversation. The word is kanon. In ordinary Greek, it meant a straight rod, a reed cut straight and used as a measuring stick or a ruler by a carpenter or a mason. From the physical object, it came to mean a standard, a rule, a norm, the thing you measure other things against. Christian writers eventually applied it to the list of books received as scripture. The books were the canon, not merely a list, but the measuring rod. The Greek word for the books themselves is simpler, biblia, the plural of biblion, a small scroll, from biblos, the Phoenician port through which papyrus came into the Greek world. The Bible is, at root, just the books. The plural became a singular in Latin somewhere along the way, and a library turned into a volume. But how did anyone decide which books? There is a popular story about this, and it is wrong, and I want to clear it away gently because you may have heard it. The story says that a council of rabbis met at a place called Jamnia, or Yavne, around the year 90 after Christ, and voted on which books were in and which were out, and thereby created the Hebrew Bible. There was a rabbinic academy at Yavne. Discussions there did touch on the status of one or two books, particularly Ecclesiastes and the Song of Songs. But the idea of a formal canonizing council at Jamnia was a scholarly reconstruction of the late 19th century, and specialists in the field abandoned it decades ago. The evidence points somewhere less dramatic and, I think, more interesting. The collection was not decided at a meeting, it settled. Here is the earliest clear witness, and it is a lovely one, because it is a grandson writing about his grandfather. Around the year 132 before Christ, a man arrived in Egypt and set about translating into Greek a book of wisdom his grandfather had written in Hebrew. His grandfather's name was Jesus ben Sira. The book is known as Sirach, or Ecclesiasticus. The grandson wrote a short prologue to explain what he was doing, and in it he apologizes, rather charmingly, for the difficulty of translation, noting that things do not have the same force in another language. And 3 times in that short prologue, describing what his grandfather had devoted himself to studying, he refers to the scriptures in a threefold way: the law and the prophets and the others that followed them. Elsewhere he calls the third group the other books of our fathers. 3 divisions: law, prophets, and a third group he does not have a settled name for. He simply calls them the rest. That threefold shape is the shape of the Hebrew Bible to this day. Jews call it the Tanakh, an acronym built from the 3: Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, law, prophets, writings. Notice what the grandson's uncertainty tells us. By 132 before Christ, the first 2 divisions are firm enough to name. The third is real, but not yet fixed enough to have a title. That is what a collection looks like while it is settling. 2nd Maccabees, written around 124 before Christ, describes Nehemiah founding a library and gathering the books about the kings and the prophets and the writings of David. Whether that is history or later memory, it reflects the same 3-part sense of the material. The next major witness is Josephus, and he is worth a proper introduction, since he will be a companion on this channel for a long time. Flavius Josephus was born in Jerusalem around the year 37 after Christ, into a priestly family with royal connections. He commanded rebel forces in Galilee during the Great Revolt against Rome, was captured, and ended his life in Rome under imperial patronage, writing history in Greek for a Roman readership. He is not a neutral source. Nobody in the ancient world is. But he is our single most valuable witness to Jewish life in the 1st century, and he had access to information nobody else preserved. In a late work called Against Apion, written sometime after the year 94, defending Judaism against Greek critics, he makes a claim about the scriptures. He says that the Jews do not have an innumerable multitude of books contradicting one another, as the Greeks do, but only 22 books, containing the record of all time, which are justly believed to be divine. He then breaks the 22 down. 5 belong to Moses. 13 were written by the prophets who came after Moses, covering the period from Moses to the reign of Artaxerxes. The remaining 4 contain hymns to God and precepts for human life. 22 rather than the 24 of later Jewish counting, or the 39 of a Protestant Old Testament. The difference is not about contents, but about how you bundle them. Counting Ruth with Judges, for instance, and Lamentations with Jeremiah, and treating the 12 minor prophets as a single scroll, which physically they were. Then Josephus adds a sentence that has echoed for 2,000 years. He says that a complete history has been written from Artaxerxes to his own time, but that it has not been held equal in credit to the earlier records because the exact succession of the prophets had failed. The succession of the prophets had failed. That is a 1st century Jewish historian saying, in passing, that prophecy had stopped, and that everyone knew when it stopped, and that this is why the collection closes where it closes. We will come back to that in the last part of tonight, because it is where the Old Testament ends. Alongside all of this runs a separate stream, the tradition about who actually wrote the books. The classical statement is in the Babylonian Talmud, in Tractate Bava Batra, at pages 14b and 15a. It is presented as a baraita, an older teaching quoted inside the later discussion, so the material is likely to predate the Talmud's compilation. It first gives an order for the books, which is not quite the order in a modern Bible, and then asks directly, and who wrote them? Moses wrote his own book, and the passage about Balaam, and the book of Job. Joshua wrote his own book, and the 8 verses of the Torah that describe the death of Moses. Samuel wrote his book, and Judges, and Ruth. David wrote the Psalms by the hand of 10 elders, and it names them, including Adam and Melchizedek, and Abraham and Moses and Asaph, and the sons of Korah. Jeremiah wrote his own book, and Kings and Lamentations. Hezekiah and his colleagues wrote Isaiah, Proverbs, the Song of Songs, and Ecclesiastes. The men of the Great Assembly wrote Ezekiel, the 12, Daniel, and Esther. Ezra wrote his own book, and the genealogies of Chronicles. Now, read that carefully and notice something. This is a traditional Jewish source, of considerable authority, and it does not say that every book was written by the person whose name it bears. It has Jeremiah writing Kings. It has Hezekiah's circle producing the book of Isaiah, a compiling and editorial role, centuries after some of the material. It has an anonymous body, the men of the Great Assembly, responsible for 4 books. The tradition itself, in other words, has always understood that these books came through hands, that prophets spoke, and others wrote, and later others gathered. The sages then argue, in the same passage, about who wrote the final 8 verses of Deuteronomy describing the death of Moses, since Moses could hardly describe his own burial. One view says Joshua wrote them. Another, attributed to Rabbi Shimon, says that Moses wrote them too, with God speaking and Moses writing in tears. I find that image almost unbearable, and I think it is one of the most beautiful things in the whole of rabbinic literature. God dictating the account of a man's death, and the man himself setting it down, weeping because it is the last thing he will write. That is tradition speaking, in its own register, about the making of a text. It is not archaeology, and does not pretend to be. It belongs to a different order of knowing, and it deserves to be quoted accurately and left standing. Now we come to the caves, and to the single most important manuscript discovery in the history of the Bible. It begins with a goat. Sometime between November of 1946 and February of 1947. The sources vary, and the men involved gave different accounts later. Bedouin shepherds of the Tamira were moving flocks along the limestone cliffs above the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, near a ruin called Qumran. A young man named Muhammad Ed Dib was looking for a stray animal. There is a narrow opening in the cliff face. He threw a stone into it, expecting either nothing or the sound of a startled goat. He heard pottery break. He came back, with a cousin or alone depending on which telling you follow, and got inside and found jars. Most were empty. One held earth. One held a leather scroll, and 2 long objects wrapped in cloth and coated with something like pitch. Those 3 items were the Great Isaiah Scroll, a commentary on Habakkuk, and the document scholars call the Community Rule. The scrolls went to a dealer in Bethlehem, and then into a tangle of negotiations that ran through the Syriac Orthodox Metropolitan of Jerusalem, the Hebrew University, the War of 1948, and eventually an advertisement in the Wall Street Journal. That story is worth an evening on its own. Searching of the surrounding cliffs went on until 1956 and produced 11 caves and the remains of roughly 900 manuscripts, most in thousands of fragments. Every book of the Hebrew Bible, except Esther, is represented among them. But the first find remains the greatest. The Great Isaiah Scroll, scholars label it 1Q Isaiah A, is 17 sheets of parchment sewn together, 24 feet long, about 10 inches high, ruled into 54 columns. It contains the entire book of Isaiah, all 66 chapters, from beginning to end, with only small damaged patches. It is the only biblical book from the Qumran caves preserved almost entire. Radiocarbon dating gives a range. Paleographic dating puts the writing at roughly 150 to 100 years before Christ. Call it a century and a quarter before the birth of Christ, made in the Hasmonean period. Now understand what that meant in 1947. Before that cave, the oldest complete Hebrew manuscripts of the Bible available to scholars were medieval, the great Masoretic codices of the 10th and 11th centuries after Christ. The Isaiah scroll was suddenly 1,000 years older than anything anyone had. 1,000 years of copying, from the scroll in that jar to the codices in the libraries. The obvious and pressing question: what had happened to the text in between? The answer, when the comparison was made, was extraordinary. The text of Isaiah in that scroll is recognizably, substantially, overwhelmingly the same book as the Isaiah in a Hebrew Bible printed this year. Not identical. Let us be exact, because exactness is the whole point of this part of the story. Scholars have cataloged more than 2,600 textual variants between the Great Isaiah Scroll and the Masoretic text. That number sounds alarming until you look at what the variants are. The overwhelming majority are spelling differences. The scroll uses fuller spellings, adding letters that mark vowels, in the way a modern writer might spell a word out where an older convention abbreviated it. Others are small grammatical variations, or a word order swapped, or a synonym. Some are simple copying errors. The scribe of this particular scroll was, in the judgment of scholars like Martin Abegg, Peter Flint, and Eugene Ulrich, somewhat careless in places compared with other Isaiah copies from the same caves. A handful are substantive enough that modern critical editions note them, and a few have been adopted into modern translations where they appear to preserve a better reading. But the book is the book. A reader who knows Isaiah would sit down with that scroll and be at home in it immediately. Here is the third reading I will offer you tonight, and it is the one I hold most strongly. The reading I find most persuasive is that the significance of the Dead Sea Scrolls has been consistently oversold in both directions, and that what they actually show is better than either exaggeration. One side says the scrolls prove the text never changed at all, and that is not what a scroll with 2,600 variants proves. The other side says the scrolls prove the text was fluid and unreliable, and that is not what a fully recognizable Isaiah from before the time of Christ proves either. What they show is a text carried by human beings, with human hands and human tiredness, across 1,000 years, and arriving substantially intact. Spellings drift. Word order wobbles. A scribe skips a line and someone catches it, and the book comes through. I find that more moving than a miracle of mechanical perfection would be, because it is a picture of faithfulness rather than magic. Somebody was always careful enough. For 1,000 years, in every generation, somebody was careful enough. The caves gave us something else, though, and it is the part of the discovery that took longest to understand. When the fragments from the other caves were sorted and published, a process that ran across decades and generated its own controversies about access, a pattern emerged. The biblical manuscripts at Qumran do not all belong to one family. Emanuel Tov of the Hebrew University, who served as editor-in-chief of the publication project, has done as much as anyone to map this. The picture that emerged is of several streams flowing side by side. A clear majority of the biblical scrolls belong to what scholars call the Proto-Masoretic tradition. The ancestor of the text the Masoretes would later fix, and the text behind your English Old Testament. But some manuscripts stand closer to a different tradition, one preserved by the Samaritan community, and some stand closer to the Hebrew that must have lain behind the Greek of the Septuagint. That last point is worth pausing on, because it settled an old argument. For a long time, where the Septuagint differed from the Hebrew, the natural assumption was that the Greek translators had been loose or careless. The book of Jeremiah is the sharpest case. The Greek version is substantially shorter than the Hebrew, by something like an eighth, and arranges some material differently. Then, in Cave 4 at Qumran, fragments of Jeremiah turned up in Hebrew, in a short form, matching the arrangement of the Greek. So the Alexandrian translators had not been trimming. They had been working faithfully from a Hebrew manuscript of a different edition, one that circulated alongside the longer form and then dropped out of use. Two editions of a prophetic book, both in Hebrew, both in circulation before the time of Christ. That is what the evidence shows, and I would rather tell you plainly than tidy it. What it means is a matter of interpretation, and thoughtful people take it different ways. Some see a book that grew, with the longer form representing a later expansion within the tradition. Others see an abridgment. The tradition itself, in every branch, received the longer form as the book of Jeremiah. The Samaritan tradition deserves a moment of its own, and deserves it, said carefully, because this is a community that has been on the receiving end of a great deal of casual contempt. The Samaritans are the remnant of the northern population, centered on Mount Gerizim near Nablus. There is still a Samaritan community today, numbering only in the hundreds. They have been there, keeping their tradition continuously. They receive as scripture the 5 books of Moses and nothing else. No prophets, no writings. Their Torah is written in a script descended directly from the old Paleo-Hebrew letters, the same family of letters as the Ketef Hinnom silver. Their text of the Torah differs from the Masoretic text in something like 6,000 places. The overwhelming majority of those differences are the same kind we saw in the Isaiah scroll. Fuller spellings, smoothed grammar, a clarifying word. A small number are substantive, and the most significant concerns Mount Gerizim, which the Samaritan text names as the place God chose, in a passage in the 10 Commandments that the Jewish and Christian text does not contain. Here are the registers, side by side, and I will not adjudicate between them. The record shows 2 ancient forms of the Torah, both attested before the Christian era, differing over the mountain. Jewish and Christian tradition holds that Jerusalem is the chosen place. Samaritan tradition holds that Gerizim is, and has held it, at cost for more than 2,000 years. That disagreement is old, and it is real, and it is not mine to settle from a chair. What I can say is that the existence of a second ancient stream is not a threat to anybody. It is simply what the manuscript record contains. Now, the letters themselves, because they changed shape, and the change has a story. The script on the Ketef Hinnom silver, on the Mesha stele, on the Siloam wall, on the Lachish ostraca, that is Paleo-Hebrew, the old angular alphabet of the kingdoms, descended from the Canaanite letters. The Hebrew letters in a synagogue scroll today, and in any printed Hebrew Bible, are different. They are square, upright, and they derive from the Aramaic script of the Persian Empire. The change happened during and after the exile, as Aramaic became the administrative language of the world these people lived in. The tradition preserved in the Talmud says that the square script was brought up from Babylon by Ezra, and it is called Ketev Ashuri, the Assyrian writing, for that reason. And there is a detail in the Qumran scrolls that I find quietly beautiful. In a number of manuscripts written in the square script, when the scribe reaches the divine name, the 4 Hebrew letters of the name revealed to Moses, he switches. He writes those 4 letters in the old Paleo-Hebrew, the archaic script, and then returns to the square hand for the rest of the line. Nobody instructed him to in any surviving rule. He did it because the name was different from the other words on the page. and he wanted the eye to know it before the mind did. You can see it on the parchment. The line runs along in one hand, and then there is a small window of much older letters, and then the line resumes. One more object, and then we will go back out to the cliffs. Before 1947, the oldest known fragment of the Hebrew Bible was not in a cave. It was in Cambridge, and it had been bought in Egypt in 1898 by a scholar named Walter Nash. The Nash papyrus is a single damaged sheet, about 4 inches by 3, carrying 24 lines of Hebrew. It preserves a version of the Ten Commandments, followed immediately by the opening of the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. It is usually dated to the 2nd century before Christ. For half a century, it was the oldest Hebrew biblical manuscript in the world, and it was a lonely one. Scholars had exactly one specimen from that era, and nothing to compare it against. Its combination of texts suggests it was not a scroll at all, but something devotional or liturgical. The commandments and the Shema together in one sheet for daily use. And there is one more class of object from the caves that belongs here, which is easy to walk past because the pieces are so small. Among the Qumran finds were tefillin, phylacteries, the little leather cases that observant Jews bind on the arm and the forehead in obedience to the instruction in Deuteronomy 6 verse 8, to bind them for a sign upon thine hand. Dozens of them came out of the caves, several still with their contents. The cases are tiny, some barely more than a centimeter across, stitched from thin hide and divided into compartments. And folded inside are slips of parchment, some no larger than a fingernail, carrying passages from Exodus and Deuteronomy in a hand so small that scholars have needed magnification to read it. Think about the labor in that. A scribe with a reed cut to a point finer than seems possible, writing scripture at a size meant never to be read again, because once it is folded and sewn into the case, nobody opens it. He was not writing for a reader. He was writing so that the words would be present, on a man's arm, against the skin, while he worked and ate and walked home in the dark. Some of the Qumran tefillin contain passages that later rabbinic practice did not include, which tells us the custom was still finding its settled form. That is a detail for specialists. The thing worth carrying tonight is simpler, which is, when you think about it, the same instinct as the silver plaques on their cord. Take the words that matter most. Make them small enough to carry. Keep them near. Let me put you in that landscape for a moment, because it explains why anything survived there at all. The country above the Dead Sea is the driest inhabited place many travelers will ever stand in. The cliffs are pale limestone, chalky, seamed with caves where the softer rock has weathered out. Below, the water lies flat and heavy and blue-gray, 900 feet below the level of the Mediterranean, the lowest exposed ground on the face of the earth. Nothing grows on the slopes but thorn scrub in the wadi bottoms. In summer, the air over the water shimmers, and the far shore of Moab goes soft and violet and unreal. There is a smell of hot mineral dust and, faintly, of salt. At night, the temperature drops hard, and the sky over that valley is as clear as sky gets. In winter, rain comes rarely and violently, and the wadis run for an hour and then are dry again. A leather scroll in a sealed jar in a cave in that climate is in about the best preservation environment on the planet, short of a laboratory. Put the same scroll in the damp of the Judean hills, and it is gone in a century. That is the accident at the center of everything we have said tonight. We do not have the temple library from Jerusalem because Jerusalem gets rain. We have the Qumran library because somebody hid it in a desert, which is worth sitting with, gently, when we start feeling confident about what did and did not exist in the ancient world. What survives is not what mattered most. What survives is what was dry. Now let us follow the Hebrew text into the Christian centuries, where it acquires a very energetic and rather difficult friend. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries after Christ, the Christian church was overwhelmingly Greek-speaking and used the Septuagint. Most Christians could not read Hebrew, had no access to Hebrew manuscripts, and had no particular reason to want them. Some scholars felt otherwise. Origen, working in Caesarea in the first half of the 3rd century, assembled a monumental work called the Hexapla, 6 parallel columns, setting the Hebrew text, a transliteration of the Hebrew into Greek letters, and 4 different Greek versions side by side, so that the differences could be seen. It was enormous. It was never widely copied because copying it was ruinously expensive, and it is lost apart from fragments and quotations. But the impulse behind it is the impulse of every serious textual scholar since. Go and look at the other manuscripts. Around the year 170 after Christ, a bishop named Melito of Sardis, in Asia Minor, wanted to know exactly which books belonged to the Old Testament. Rather than guess, he traveled east to the land itself to find out, and sent home a list. It survives because Eusebius quoted it. It is essentially the Hebrew collection, but the figure who changes everything is Jerome. He was born in Stridon, on the borders of Dalmatia and Pannonia, at a date nobody can fix. The estimates run from about 331 to about 347, and the disagreement is genuine. His own writings pull in different directions. He was educated in Rome under the grammarian Aelius Donatus, in the full classical curriculum, and he was formidably gifted with languages and formidably difficult as a colleague. In 383, Pope Damasus asked him to sort out the Latin Bible. There was a real problem to sort. Latin translations, made from the Greek, had multiplied without control. Augustine complained that the Latin translators were beyond counting. Jerome began with the Gospels. Then he moved to the Old Testament. And there he did something nobody in the Latin Church had done, and which required years of work he did not have to undertake. He learned Hebrew, in Middle Age, from Jewish teachers, at considerable social cost, in a period when that was an unusual thing for a Christian scholar to do. He then moved to Bethlehem and settled there, and between roughly 390 and 405, he translated the Old Testament out of the Hebrew. His principle he called the Hebraica Veritas, the Hebrew truth. His argument was straightforward and, to many of his contemporaries, shocking. The Septuagint is a translation. Translations can err. Where the Greek and the Hebrew differ, the original language governs. Augustine of Hippo disagreed, and their correspondence about it survives and is one of the great exchanges in Christian letters. Two enormous minds, at a distance, in a slow argument conducted by ship. Augustine's objection was not stupid, and it was not merely conservative. He argued that the Septuagint had the weight of the whole church behind it, that congregations everywhere had heard it for centuries, that a translation made by one man from a language almost nobody in the West could check was a translation nobody could verify. And he had a practical example, which is my favorite piece of evidence about how ordinary people relate to the words they have grown up on. In a town in North Africa, Oia, in what is now Libya, a bishop read Jerome's new version of Jonah aloud in the liturgy. At Jonah 4 verse 6, where a plant grows up to shade the prophet, the Old Latin had cucurbita, gourd. Jerome, working from the Hebrew word kikayon, had put hedera, ivy. The congregation nearly rioted, not over a doctrine, over a plant. The gourd of Jonah was everywhere in early Christian art. You find it on sarcophagi and in the catacombs. And the people of that town had heard gourd every year of their lives, and they were not going to be told it was ivy by a man in Bethlehem. Augustine reported the incident to Jerome as evidence of the danger of his project. Jerome wrote back, with the sharpness he was known for, complaining that Augustine had not even told him which word was in dispute, and then defending his rendering on philological grounds, and adding that he had already answered this in his commentary. He also allowed, in a rather generous moment, that if the Hebrew plant was in fact neither gourd nor ivy, but some third thing that stands upright on its own stem, he would rather keep gourd, since that is what all the Latin versions had. I love that exchange, and I love it for a reason that has nothing to do with who was right. Both men were entirely serious. Augustine was defending the Church's common life against private expertise. Jerome was defending the original against comfortable habit. Those are both legitimate goods, and they are still in tension in every translation committee that has ever sat down. And the people in Oya were not fools either. They were defending something real. The words you have heard since childhood are not merely information. They are furniture in the house of your mind, and someone moving the furniture without asking is genuinely disturbing. Anyone who has heard a familiar verse in an unfamiliar version knows exactly what those North Africans felt. Jerome's work also produced the other great consequence I promised we would return to. Because he had learned Hebrew and worked with Jewish scholars, he knew which books stood inside the Hebrew collection and which did not. He translated the Hebrew canon carefully. The additional books found in the Greek collections he treated as a second rank, useful for edification, not for establishing doctrine. His translations of some of them were rapid and reluctant. Jerome himself claimed a single day's work on Tobit. Augustine in the North African councils at Hippo in 393 and Carthage in 397 took the wider view. Jerome's Latin Bible became the standard text of the Western Church for more than 1,000 years. The name Vulgate, meaning the commonly published edition, was applied to it much later in the 16th century, and his distinction between the Hebrew canon and the additional books lay dormant in the Church's memory for a millennium, and then, at the Reformation, was picked up again. That is a compressed account of a very large subject, and I have skipped a great deal. What I want you to take from it is smaller and simpler. The question of which books belong is old. It was raised by serious people who loved the Scriptures, and it was never a matter of anyone concealing anything from anyone. Now, the last great chapter, and the one I have been most looking forward to. Between roughly the 7th and the 10th centuries after Christ, in Galilee, in a town on the western shore of the lake, Tiberias, built by Herod Antipas and named for an emperor, a group of Jewish scholars did something almost without parallel in the history of literature. They are called the Masoretes, from the word Masora. The etymology of that word has been argued over for a long time. One derivation connects it to a root, meaning to hand over, to transmit, giving the sense of tradition, the thing handed down. Another line, argued by the scholar Ze'ev ben Chaim, connects it to a verb meaning to count, which fits what these men actually did. Both senses are alive in the word as the tradition uses it, and both are correct about the work. It was transmission, and it was counting. Here was their problem. Hebrew, as it was written, recorded only consonants. The vowels lived in the reading tradition, in the way the text had always been said aloud, learned by ear, passed from teacher to student across generations. That works perfectly, as long as the chain is unbroken. It works less well after centuries of dispersion, in communities separated by empires and languages, where a chain can thin. And the stakes are not trivial. In an unpointed Hebrew text, the same 3 consonants can be several different words. The reading tradition is not decoration. It is half the meaning. So the Masoretes invented a system to write down what had never been written. A set of small dots and dashes placed above, below, and inside the consonants, marking every vowel exactly. Then they went further. They devised a second set of marks, the accents, which indicate where the stress falls, how the phrases divide, and how each verse is to be chanted. A trained reader can look at a Masoretic page and reproduce not just the words but the melody. And then, having done all that, they did the thing that I find genuinely astonishing. They counted everything. In the margins of their manuscripts, they wrote notes, a small apparatus in the side and top and bottom margins, and larger lists at the end. These notes record how many times a given word occurs in a book. They flag unusual spellings, so a later copyist would not correct them into error. They mark the middle letter of a book. They mark the middle verse of the Torah. If a word appears in an odd form in only 2 places in the entire Hebrew Bible, there is a note in the margin telling you so, and telling you where the other one is. Do you see what that system does? It makes the text self-checking. A scribe copying a manuscript with a full Masorah cannot quietly drop a line, because the count in the margin will not match. The apparatus is a lock, built by men who knew that later men would be tired. The tradition itself said as much. The early sages were called sopherim, counters, because they counted the letters of the Torah. Sit with the shape of that vocation for a moment. You are a scholar in Tiberias. You have a good mind. You could be writing philosophy, or poetry, or commentary. The age produced all 3. Instead, you spend your working life determining that a particular word occurs 11 times in this arrangement, and 3 times in that one, and writing it very small in a margin. You will not be famous. Your name may not survive. Most of theirs did not. The work is not creative in any sense a modern person would recognize, and it is completely, painstakingly, unglamorously devoted to the proposition that not one letter of this should be lost on your watch. That is the argument of their lives, and they made it in dots. The great families of Tiberias were the Ben Asher line and the Ben Naphtali line, and their systems differed in small ways. Moses ben Asher is traditionally associated with the Cairo Codex of the Prophets, dated to 896. His son Aaron ben Asher is the figure at the summit of the tradition. Around the year 930 after Christ, in Tiberias, a scribe named Solomon ben Buyah wrote out the consonantal text of a complete Hebrew Bible. Aaron ben Asher then supplied the vowels, the accents, and the Masoretic notes. That manuscript is the Aleppo Codex. For 1,000 years it was regarded as the most perfect Hebrew Bible in existence. Maimonides consulted it and made it his standard. Its later history is painful. It was kept for centuries in Aleppo and Syria. In riots in 1947, the synagogue where it was housed was burned, and when the Codex resurfaced, roughly 1/3 of it was gone, including almost all of the Torah, from the opening of Genesis through most of Deuteronomy. 294 leaves were brought to Jerusalem in 1958 and are in the shrine of the book. A single further leaf, from Exodus, surfaced in 2007. What became of the rest is not known. Because of that loss, the manuscript that scholars actually work from is a slightly later one. The Leningrad Codex, Codex Leningradensis, also called B19a, was copied in Cairo in the Fustat quarter, and its colophon dates it to 1008 or 1009 after Christ. Its scribe was Samuel ben Jacob, and unusually, one man did everything: the consonants, the vowels, and the Masoretic notes. The colophon states that it was copied and corrected against exemplars in the Ben Asher line. It is the oldest complete manuscript of the entire Hebrew Bible in existence. It is the base text of Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia and of Biblia Hebraica Quinta, which are the editions on the desk of essentially every Old Testament scholar and translator in the world, which means something rather startling and worth saying plainly. If you open a modern English Old Testament tonight, the King James on your bedside table, or any translation made sense, the Hebrew standing behind it is, in the great majority of places, the text of a manuscript written out by one man in Cairo just after the year 1000, working from the system perfected in a Galilean town a century before. That is the pipe through which the water comes. And the Dead Sea Scrolls, when they appeared, let us test that pipe against evidence 1,000 years upstream. It held. We have followed the words a long way. Let us stop now and look at the collection itself, not book by book in the order they sit on the page, but by the kind of place each one came from. Because a source-led view puts them in company they do not usually keep, and the company is illuminating. Start with the household and the campfire. Genesis is, in its first 11 chapters, a set of accounts about beginnings, creation, the flood, the scattering of peoples, that stand in obvious conversation with the literature of the wider Near East. Mesopotamia had its own flood narratives. The Epic of Gilgamesh contains one, and the Atrahasis epic another. The similarities are real and were noticed the moment the cuneiform tablets were read in the 19th century. So are the differences, which are enormous. In the Mesopotamian accounts, humanity is made to relieve the gods of labor, and the flood comes because people are noisy and the gods cannot sleep. What we do with that comparison depends on where we stand, and I will not pretend the standing places are the same. The record shows shared narrative furniture across the region. Interpretation ranges from independent tradition to deliberate response. The tradition holds that Moses received what he wrote. What is not in dispute is that Genesis, in that shared world, is saying something markedly different from its neighbors about what a human being is for. From chapter 12, Genesis becomes family history, a man leaving Ur, tents and wells and wives and quarrels over grazing, the specific texture of pastoral life. Then Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, the deliverance, the mountain, the wilderness, the instruction, the long farewell on the plains of Moab. These 5 are the Torah, and they are the ground of everything. Every later book assumes them. Next, the archive of a state, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings form a continuous account from the entry into the land to the burning of Jerusalem. Scholars have long called this the Deuteronomistic history, because it evaluates every king by the standard of Deuteronomy. Did he tolerate the high places, or did he not? Behind it stand real records. The books of Kings repeatedly refer the reader elsewhere, to the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel and the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah. Those source documents are lost, but their existence is asserted openly by the biblical writers themselves, who plainly expected their readers to be able to consult them. That is a court archive speaking. Regnal years, building projects, tribute, campaigns, the deaths and burials of kings. It is the same kind of material Assyria and Babylon kept by a smaller kingdom in the same period, and then shaped by editors asking a theological question about it. Chronicles covers much of the same ground later, from a priestly and Jerusalem-centered angle, and is usually dated to the Persian period. Ezra and Nehemiah continue it, and Nehemiah in particular contains long passages in the first person that read like a personal memoir. Third, the prophetic collections. These are not books in the sense that a modern reader assumes. A prophet spoke, in a court, at a gate, in a temple court, on a road, and what he said was remembered, and some of it was written, and disciples gathered it. Isaiah 8 verse 16 has a striking line in this connection. Bind up the testimony, seal the law among my disciples. That is a prophet giving instructions about the preservation of his words. And in Jeremiah 36, we get the most detailed picture in the whole Bible of a prophetic book being made. Jeremiah dictates to Baruch, the son of Neriah, who writes it on a scroll. Baruch reads it publicly. It is read to the officials, and then to the king. The king, Jehoiakim, sitting by a fire in the winter house, cuts the scroll into pieces with a penknife as it is read to him, column by column, and throws the pieces into the fire until the whole scroll is burned. And then Jeremiah dictates it again, to the same scribe, and the text notes that there were added besides unto them many like words. That single chapter is worth an hour of study. It tells us there were prophets who did not write personally, but dictated. It tells us there were professional scribes attached to them. It tells us a scroll could be destroyed and reconstituted from memory and dictation. And it tells us the second edition was longer than the first. If you want a picture of how a prophetic book came to exist, you do not have to reconstruct one. The Bible describes the process in detail, and it is not embarrassed about it. Fourth, the wisdom schools, Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes, and much of the Psalms belong to a stream of literature that runs all across the ancient Near East. Egypt produced instruction texts of exactly this kind for centuries. A senior official writing advice to his son about conduct, speech, money, and the management of superiors. One of them, the instruction of a Menemope, has a section that runs remarkably parallel to a passage in Proverbs 22 and 23. The relationship between them has been discussed for a century. Job stands somewhat apart and is one of the strangest and greatest things in the collection. A poem of enormous power, in difficult Hebrew, set in a country outside Israel, wrestling with the suffering of a man who has done nothing to deserve it, and refusing every easy answer offered to him. The rabbinic tradition in Bava Batra attributes Job to Moses. Some sages in the same discussion questioned whether Job was a historical person at all, or whether the book is a parable. That argument is inside the tradition, not imported from outside it. Fifth, the hymn book. The Psalms are the songs of the temple, gathered over a very long period. The collection carries superscriptions of David, of Asaph, of the sons of Korah, a psalm of Moses, and it is divided into 5 books, which the tradition understood as a deliberate echo of the 5 books of the Torah. Some psalms are plainly liturgical, written for processions and festivals. Some are personal to the point of discomfort. Some are royal. A few are furious. And these were sung. That is easy to forget when they sit as text on a page. The Masoretic accents preserve the chant of the reading tradition. The psalm headings preserve fragments of musical direction we can no longer decode. Words like Selah and to the chief musician upon Gittith survive as a rumor of instructions nobody now understands. There was music in that building, and we have the lyrics and have lost the tunes. Sixth and last, the books of the difficult centuries. Daniel and Esther, and the later prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, belong to the Persian period and after, and they are concerned with a people who are no longer a kingdom, living under empires, working out how to be faithful without a throne. Esther, famously, never mentions God. Daniel is written partly in Hebrew and partly in Aramaic, switching languages mid-book, which is itself a snapshot of the world it came from. And that is the collection. A family history, a state archive, several prophetic dossiers, a wisdom curriculum, a hymn book, and a set of writings from under occupation, assembled over a millennium, by farmers and kings and priests and disciples and clerks and exiles, bound together, eventually, by a community that decided these particular scrolls, and not others, measured everything else. Which brings us, at last, to the end of it, to Malachi. We do not know who he was. The name means my messenger, and it is possible it is a title rather than a name. The tradition of Bava Batra places the book among those gathered by the men of the Great Assembly. The book is short, 4 chapters in an English Bible, 3 in the Hebrew arrangement. It is set in the Persian period, after the temple was rebuilt, when the Great Return had settled into ordinary, disappointing life. Its concerns are unglamorous. The priests are offering damaged animals, blind and lame beasts they would not dare present to a governor. People are neglecting their marriages. The tithes are not coming in. Nobody is doing anything dramatic, Things are simply going slack. It is written as a series of exchanges. God states something, the people answer back with a question. God responds, "Wherein have we despised thy name? Wherein have we wearied him? Wherein shall we return?" That is the last voice in the collection. A people asking, slightly defensively, what exactly they are supposed to have done wrong. And then the closing lines, which in the King James run, "Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And he shall turn the heart of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to their fathers." The Hebrew arrangement of the books does not end there. In a Hebrew Bible, the order is different, and the last book is Chronicles, closing with the decree of Cyrus and an invitation to go up. The Christian arrangement, following the Septuagint's ordering, ends with Malachi. Both endings are old, and both are meaningful. But in the Bible on your shelf, the last word of the Old Testament is a promise about a prophet who will come, and about hearts turning toward each other across generations. And then, from the perspective of the collection, nothing. Josephus put it in that sentence we read earlier. From Artaxerxes to our own times, a history has been written, but it has not been held equal in credit because the exact succession of the prophets failed. The rabbinic tradition says something similar. In Tractate Sanhedrin, the sages state that after Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, the Holy Spirit departed from Israel. Roughly 400 years pass between the last of the prophets and the opening of the New Testament. Christians have traditionally called them the silent centuries. They were not silent in any ordinary sense. They were among the most eventful in Jewish history. Alexander, the Ptolemies, the Seleucids, the desecration of the temple under Antiochus, the Maccabean revolt, an independent Jewish kingdom, and then Rome. Enormous literature was produced in that period, some of it magnificent. What is meant by silence is narrower and more particular. No voice arose that the community as a whole recognized as standing in the line of Moses and Isaiah and Jeremiah. The succession, as Josephus said, failed. And that failure, that silence, is precisely what closed the collection. Nobody voted the Old Testament shut. It closed because prophecy stopped, and everyone knew it had stopped, and books written after the stopping were valued and read and copied, but were not put in the same class. That is a canon formed not by decree, but by a community's shared sense of when the well went dry. It is a much more human process than the story of the council at Jamnia, and I think a much more credible one. There is a long stretch of the story we have only touched, and I want to acknowledge it before we come home, because it is the part that reaches your own bookshelf. After the Masoretes, the Hebrew text was stable. What changed was who could get at it. For most of the medieval period in Western Europe, the Bible in ordinary use was Jerome's Latin, in manuscript, in monastic and cathedral libraries. Copying was slow and costly. A complete Bible represented the skins of an entire flock and the working years of trained hands. Then, in Mainz, around the year 1455, a Latin Bible was printed with movable type, and the economics of the written word changed permanently. Hebrew Bibles were being printed within a few decades. Greek editions followed, and the 16th century brought a wave of translation into the spoken languages of Europe, with all the conflict that entailed, and a great deal of courage on the part of people who paid for it. The King James translators sat down in 1604 and finished in 1611. They worked in 6 companies, in Westminster and Oxford and Cambridge, and they were not composing freshly. They were revising, standing on Tyndale and the Bishop's Bible and the Geneva Bible before them. They had the Hebrew of the Masoretes, in printed rabbinic editions. They did not have the Dead Sea Scrolls. They did not have the Aleppo Codex. They did not have Ketef Hinnom, or Lachish, or Arad, or the Tel Dan stele, or the Cyrus cylinder. or any of the tens of thousands of ancient documents that have come out of the ground since. And here is what I find remarkable. When all of that material did come out of the ground, over the following 4 centuries, it did not overturn the text they had been given. It deepened it. It gave it a landscape, and neighbors, and weather, and the names of the kings on the other side of the border. The book those men rendered into English is the same book that a man in Judah copied by lamplight with a cut reed, and that a family carried to Babylon in their memories, and that a scholar in Tiberias counted the letters of, and that a shepherd's stone found sealed in a jar above the Dead Sea. So let us go back to the beginning, and to the small thing we started with. 1979. The ridge called Ketef Hinnom, southwest of the old city, looking across the valley. A burial cave that had been emptied and reused and emptied again for 2,500 years, holding nothing that anybody expected to matter. And under the floor, in a repository the looters never found, a strip of silver about the length of a finger, rolled up tight. We know a little about who might have worn it. It was found in a tomb of the elite, a family of means, with a well-cut chamber and 1,000 objects accumulated over generations of burials. It was made to be worn, rolled small, on a cord, against the skin, under the clothing, which means someone put it on in the morning without thinking about it, the way you might put on a wedding ring. It was there while they worked. It was there while they ate. It was there in the dark. And what was on it was a blessing. Not a spell, not a curse against enemies, not a claim of status. A blessing, and specifically the blessing that the priests were instructed to speak over the people, the one preserved for us at Numbers 6 verse 24 to 26. The Lord bless thee and keep thee. The Lord make his face shine upon thee, and be gracious unto thee. The Lord lift up his countenance upon thee, and give thee peace. Consider the date of that object one more time, late 7th century before Christ, which means it was made and worn in the years just before everything ended. The person who wore it was alive while the Arad quartermaster was writing out wine rations, alive while an officer in the Shephelah was watching the horizon for a fire that did not come, alive in the city, or near it, when the Babylonian army closed around the walls. They did not know what was coming. Or perhaps they did. The prophets were saying so, loudly, in the streets, and being told they were weakening the hands of the people. And what that person chose to carry, against the skin, into whatever was coming, was 7 lines about being kept, and being shone upon, and being given peace. The city burned. The temple came down. The tombs on the ridge were emptied by robbers, and emptied again, and used for storing rifles, and forgotten. And the small rolled thing stayed in the dark under a stone floor for 2,600 years, and it is the oldest piece of scripture anyone has ever found. That is not a proof of anything. I want to be careful even now at the end, not to make it carry weight it cannot bear. It is a single object, and archaeology is full of accidents, and what survives is what was dry and what was overlooked. But it is a very good picture of what this whole long history has actually been. Not an institution protecting a document, not a council issuing a decree. A person whose name we will never know, keeping a blessing close, in a bad year because the words meant something, and then another person, and another, and another, for 100 generations. A scribe with black fingertips, a grandson in Alexandria apologizing for his Greek, a Levite at the Watergate turning Hebrew into Aramaic for a crowd that had stood up, a scholar in Tiberias writing a very small note in a margin about a word that occurs 11 times, a shepherd throwing a stone into a cave and hearing pottery break, every one of them handling something they were certain had not started with them and would not end with them, and was theirs only to pass along without dropping, which is, when you consider it, The same thing as wearing it against the skin. That is where we will leave it tonight. The silver plaques are in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem now, in a climate-controlled case, unrolled and flattened and lit so that the letters can be seen. Photographed at high resolution, studied by specialists, published and republished in the journals. They are perhaps 2 miles from the hillside where they lay. It took them 2,500 years to travel that distance. And the words on them are the words that a great many of you have heard spoken over you at the end of a service on a Sunday morning, with the congregation standing and the light coming through the windows and somebody's hand raised. The same 7 lines, older than the exile, older than the scroll in the temple, older than anything else we have. The Lord bless thee and keep thee. That is enough for tonight. Sleep well. The scribes have finished their work, and the lamps in Tiberias are out, and everything they counted is still here, and nothing needs to be held on to now. The blessing keeps. It has been keeping for a very long time.